Okay, so today I'll be sewing the Evie Dress View A, which has long sleeves. You can see it's got ruffles inserted into the bodice. It has elasticated sleeve cuffs, which are clean finished. And the neckline is finished with a self-bias binding. And there's a centre back button placket. We're going to start with the skirt. Here I've got the two skirt panels with right sides together, and I'm just checking to see where the centre front and centre back necks are, and that tells me which is the waist edge. And we're going to be sewing a 1 centimetre seam down the left and right sides. That's 3/8 of an inch. So just sewing here with a regular straight stitch, making sure that the raw edges are together and that the panels meet at the bottom. And if you have an overlocker, you can overlock those seams closed. If you don't have an overlocker or serger, you can just do a zigzag stitch right at the edge. Now here's the overlocked seams. Do a bit of a close-up there. And the next thing to do is to sew a gathering stitch right around the waist edge. So that's the edge that has those centre front and centre back necks. I'm going to stop and start at the side seams. That will help with the gathering. And we're sewing about 6 mil from the waist edge. So here we have the skirt with the gathering stitch around the waist, and now we can do the hem. So with the right side out, we're going to turn the hem in 1 centimetre, then 2.5 centimetres, which is 3/8 of an inch, then 1 inch. Now you can press these folds in, or you can do a bit of a cheat way, which I like to do, which is I firstly fold the edge in just with my fingers as I sew, 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimetre, and just do, with a very long stitch, I just sort of sew right around the hem, and that just means that I don't have to iron it up. And then I'm ready to turn the hem edge up 1 inch or 2.5 centimetres, and I've got a nice neat edge that I can follow now. So I'm just going to quickly go right round. So I'm sewing at 2.5 centimetres or 1 inch right around the hem. Now I'm just going to remove that first stitch I did with the long stitch length, which is pretty easy to do if your stitch is long. Just take it in sections and pull the threads out. So I've already cut out my dress in main fabric. Please refer to my earlier video for how to cut the main fabric out. Right now I'm cutting out some interfacing that I'm going to iron on to the wrong side of the centre back bodices. So I'm just using the provided pattern piece here, and I'll need 2 of them. Pattern instruction says cut 2, and next I'm going to iron it onto my main fabric, and here we can see I've done that, and I'm just checking to see that I can still see those nicks. There are 2 nicks at the neck edge and at the waist edge of that centre back bodice, and that's where we're going to double fold the placket. And here I have ironed in those folds, and I'm folding it towards the wrong side of the fabric. And now I'm just going to sew along the fold line to stitch in the back placket. And once we've sewn in both of the back plackets, we are going to join the shoulder seams. So with right sides together, put the back bodices on top of the front, match up those shoulders, and we will sew a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch. And over to the sewing machine, we're going to just line up those shoulders and sew 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. And if you have an overlocker, you can then overlock those seams closed. Okay, here we have a pair of side front bodices and a pair of side back bodices. So we want to open them up, and with right sides together, we want to place the fronts onto the backs. And here I'm just showing the shoulder seams having been sewn and overlocked for the centre bodices and the side bodices. Okay, so now we need to move on to the ruffles. We have two ruffles here, and we need to identify which is the straight edge and which is the curved edge. The curved edge will have a nick right in the center, the straight edge will not, and it's the straight edge that we're going to double turn towards the wrong side of the fabric, also called baby hem, sometimes a rolled edge. Okay, over to the sewing machine now, and I'm just double checking that I'm sewing the correct side, which is the straight edge with no nick. So I'm going to double turn that towards the wrong side of the fabric, and I'm aiming for about 3mm or an eighth of an inch finished. So I'm just turning it in with my fingers. This would be very, very hard to press first, so I recommend you just give this method a go, just turning as you go. As long as the fabric is cut on the straight grain and you're not using a really slippery fabric or really crazy, heavy, strange fabric. If you're just using cotton or linen or something basic, even rayon is fine. You shouldn't find it too hard to do this with your fingers. Of course, like with any new skill, it takes a bit of practice, but it's not as hard as it looks really. Just beading up here and going right to the edge. Okay, and just showing you the finished baby hem edge there. Now over to the other side of the ruffle, so that's the curved edge. We're going to lengthen our stitch length considerably to do a gathering stitch, and we want to sew about a bit less than around about 1/4 of an inch or 6mm from the edge of the fabric there. Okay, so once I have put the gathering stitch along both of the ruffles and I have overlocked and pressed my shoulder seams towards the back of the garment, I'm going to look for that center neck on the raw edge of the ruffle, and then I'm going to grab some pins and match that neck up to the shoulder seams. I'm just going to pin that together, and then I'm going to pin the ends together. And you'll see how much excess fabric there is that I'm going to gather up. So I'm using that gathering stitch, which is just a long straight stitch, and pulling on either the bobbin or the top thread there, and then just shuffling the fabric along with my fingers until it fits. And I just really want to get a nice even amount of gathering all along that edge. Okay, over to the sewing machine now, and I'm going to be sewing a 1/4 of an inch or 6mm seam to join the ruffle to the centre bodices. And what I'm doing here with my snips is just evening up some of that gather. I do find that the presser foot tends to sort of smooth out those ruffles or push them along, which you just need to control a little bit sometimes. The other thing to note is some people like to do a double row of stitching for gathering. I've always just done one row of stitching and I find that sufficient, but there really is no right or wrong. Okay, so I'm just speeding up along here, but just continuing to make sure that those ruffles, the gather is quite even along that seam. Okay, and so now that we've got both ruffles joined to the centre bodices, I'm going to check which is my front and back of the side bodices, making sure that the double neck is joined to the back and the single neck is joined to the front. The shoulder seams, which are pressed towards the back, I'm going to match them up and put a pin in there. Same with the waist edge and on the front and the waist edge on the back. I'm just going to pin those together. And I'm going to be sewing a 1cm or 3/8 of an inch seam along that edge to join those pieces. And over to the sewing machine just to show sewing that 1cm or 3/8 of an inch seam. Just making sure that the presser foot doesn't push that fabric along so that nothing matches anymore. Sometimes when you've got several layers of fabric, you just need to control that a little bit, which I'm doing just by using my snips to make sure that the fabric doesn't shift as I sew. And just showing you the overlocked seam now, and I've pressed it flat. The ruffles point towards the armhole, and I'm just going to secure those ruffles down at the waist edge so that they don't move around when I come to sew the waist, the bodice waist to the skirt. So that will mean that the seams are pointing in the correct direction. The bodice is now overlocked and the ruffles are pressed towards the armhole. We can start on the neck binding. So firstly fold the short edge in 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch, and then fold again lengthwise. The right side of the fabric should be facing outwards. Over to the sewing machine, and we're going to line up the centre back neck edge with the start of the binding, and we're going to be sewing a 1/4 of an inch seam or 6 millimeters. Binding, if you haven't done it before, can be a bit fiddly. It just takes practice, like any new skill. It's not that hard once you get the hang of it. What I'm doing now is using the natural stretch of the binding. Binding, when it's cut on the bias, it's got a natural stretch to it, which is why we use it for armholes and necklines and places on a garment where it's got a curve, basically. So the binding stretches around the curve. And I'm just keeping the raw edges of the binding and the neckline together. And I'm trying really hard not to stretch the bodice neckline because it won't look very good. So I'm trying to keep the neck edge of the bodice as flat as possible and always keeping an eye on the grain of the fabric as I sew. And before I get to the other end, I'm going to fold that binding in 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch again, so that it lines up perfectly with the centre back edge of the bodice. Now we're going to fold the edge of the binding over that stitch line and edge stitch the seam. So we're going to sew quite close to the seam, and we're going to do that all around the neckline. This just it helps to keep the binding rolling in towards the inside of the garment. I have noticed that a lot of sewers at home don't do this. I don't really know why. This is the way that they put binding on professionally if they don't have a folder. So a folder is that attachment for your industrial sewing machine where you thread the binding through and it just automatically folds it for you as you're stitching along, which is great, but you don't tend to get those for domestic machines. I certainly don't have one. So this is the sort of more manual method of putting on binding, but I think this is an important step. This is what it looks like on the inside of the garment. Now I'm going to fold the binding in towards the wrong side of the garment, and here I'm starting to top stitch the binding down starting from the shoulder. Now the reason I'm not starting right at the centre back edge is purely because my domestic sewing machine does not like going over bumps, and it's really hard to start right on the edge there. So you'll see later how I go back and top stitch that first section at the end. So I'm stitching fairly close to the folded inside edge of the binding, but I'm really more concerned about getting a nice even top stitch around the neck edge. So if you focus on the finished neck edge and do an even top stitch, that will look better than if you focus on the inside edge of the excuse me, binding. So I'm top stitching right to the edge there, trying not to stretch out that neck as I sew. You want to keep the natural grain of the bodice as flat as possible. Okay, so that's looking quite good. And now I'm going to go back to that first section that I missed and start at the shoulder and then top stitch round to the centre back edge. If I was on an industrial machine, I wouldn't really have this problem. I could start right at the edge. It's just really domestic machines that aren't very good at going over bumps. Here is the neckline after I've top stitched it, and you can see that the inside edge kind of lifts up a little bit. Now if you just put some steam and an iron onto that, it'll flatten right out, as you can see here. It's looking really good, but it is important to press that neck edge to make it nice and flat. Just zooming in on it now, hopefully you can see the detail of the stitch lines there, and it's looking pretty neat and tidy. So just opening up the sleeves now, we've got a pair of sleeves, and you can identify the left and right by the necks. Double neck means the back, single means the front, and what we're going to do now is sew a gathering stitch along the sleeve head, just between the front and back necks, not all the way along the sleeve. Okay, so laying the bodice on the table right side up, matching the front and back necks, so the double for the back, single for the front, and single neck at the centre of the sleeve head for the shoulder. And now I'm just going to pin the ruffle out of the way, because it does get in the way. It'll just make it a bit easier to access that armhole of the bodice. So with right sides together, you want to put the sleeve on top of the bodice, matching that shoulder neck in the centre. Okay, over to the sewing machine, and just going to match the underarm of the sleeve up with the bodice, and we're going to be sewing a 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch seam around the sleeve head. And just making sure that the raw edges meet together nicely. Children's wear, small sleeves, small armholes. This can be a bit tricky. We're sewing a concave shape, which is the sleeve head, into a convex shape, which is the armhole. So one's an outie, one's an innie, and just the nature of joining those two pieces, it can be a bit tricky if you're not used to it. The gathering thread, I shouldn't really call it a gathering thread, it's really just a long stitch to ease in the edge of the sleeve head, and that really helps draw the very edge of the sleeve head in, so that we can match the nicks as we go around. I stress though that there is no gather in the sleeve head. There's no actual gather. The gathering thread is just to help you ease the sleeve head in. Okay, and just speeding up here a bit because I'm trying to do it very carefully. It's taking a while. And as you can see, the sleeve really does match perfectly into the armhole. And over to the table, where we can see that the sleeves have been sewn into both armholes, and I have also overlocked that seam. And what we want to do now is, with right sides together, we want to match the side seams and the sleeve seams. So we should have the underarm matching nicely, the waist edge matching nicely, and the bottom of the sleeve matching well. Over to the machine, and I'm going to be sewing a 1 centimetre seam, or 3/8 of an inch, starting at the waist, making sure that the underarm matches nicely. I have my seams pointing towards the sleeve, and just sewing one continuous seam all the way to the sleeve hem edge. Then I've overlocked that seam closed, and now we can turn the bodice to the right side. The next thing we're going to do is overlap the centre back placket, left over right. The general rule for girls is right over left at the front, left over right at the back. I know a lot of people don't do that. That's how I was taught at design school. It's how I always do it. And the next thing we're going to do is just do a gathering stitch at the back of the sleeve hem. Over to the machine, we're going to turn the sleeve hem edge in 6mm and then 1 centimetre. So that's a quarter of an inch and then 3/8 of an inch. So the sleeve tunnel or channel is for the elastic that we're going to thread through. We'll be threading through quarter of an inch wide elastic or 6mm wide elastic. So we want that channel to finish a couple of mil or 1/8 of an inch wider than the actual elastic. So that's why we are aiming to have the finished tunnel 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch. So we're going to have enough room for that elastic to be threaded through. Now the reason for the gathering stitch across the back hem only is that it's a concave shape, and so when you're double turning a concave shape you really need to ease that edge in. The front curve of the sleeve is actually, it curves up, so it's a convex shape, and that's quite easy to double turn. And before we get to the end, we're just going to leave a gap of about 1 centimetre or 3/8 of an inch so that we can thread that elastic through. So here's the finished sleeve tunnel or channel. It looks pretty good, and there's a little gap there right at the seam to thread the elastic through. So I have cut 2 lengths of the elastic. You can refer to either the spec or the sleeve pattern for the lengths, depending on what size you're making. And I've just attached a safety pin, and I'm going to just thread it through now. Just making sure that you don't lose the end, and then once you've got the 2 ends, just double checking to make sure that you haven't twisted the elastic inside the casing. And now I'm just overlapping the ends 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, and I'm actually just going to do a hand stitch together. I find a hand stitch with this narrow elastic easier than doing it by machine. Just a quick few stitches to hold it together. And then once you've done that, you can just close up the gap with your sewing machine. Now we are ready to attach the skirt to the bodice. So keep the skirt with the right side facing out, but turn the bodice so that the right side is on the inside. Now you're going to place the skirt inside the bodice with the hem facing down, pointing in the same direction as the neck. So you've got the 2 waist edges together with right sides together. Now I'm pinning the centre front necks of the bodice and the skirt together, and I'm pinning the side seams of the bodice and the skirt together. And then I'm going to gather the skirt in between those pins so that the skirt fits the bodice. So I'm just pulling on either the top or bottom thread of the gathering stitch, and just ruching it along with my fingers until it fits. Now try and get the gather as even as possible at this stage. It'll just help you when you go over to the sewing machine. And now do the same for the back. And over to the machine where I'm going to sew a 1 centimetre seam or 3/8 of an inch all around the waist. And so again I'm using my snips here just to ensure that the gathers are even. I'm just sort of ruching the gather up or down as needed with the pointy bit of the snips, and sometimes squashing those gathers down to ensure that they don't get spread out by the machine's presser foot. And after this, I'm going to go over to the overlocker and just overlock the seam closed. If you don't have an overlocker, any of these overlocked seams can be finished with a zigzag stitch. And this is what the finished waist seam looks like, all overlocked. Now I'm going to turn the garment to the right side, and we can press that waist seam upwards, and it looks pretty good. Here I'm using the provided buttonhole template just to mark in those positions, just marking them with pins, and then I'm going to sew them in. Here are the finished buttonholes and buttons. So I've just spliced those buttonholes open with my snips. This is the final dress. I've just given it one last press and I'm really happy with how it's looking. If you think you want to have a go sewing the Evie dress, please head over to Etsy.com and search for my store, PaperDollPatternCo. This is the Evie dress View A with long sleeves. Thanks so much for watching.